Welcome to Tales by Tochi. These stories are real, unique and exceptional because they are from personal experiences around the African culture. Don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me, and also you will be able to enjoy and learn from these amazing stories. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. It was a bright Sunday morning, and the Glory Tabernacle auditorium buzzed with activity. The air was rich with the scent of fresh paint and expensive perfumes, mingled with the aroma of roasted plantains from the nearby roadside vendor. The ushers, dressed in their navy blue uniforms and white gloves, scurried around to ensure that everything was in order before the service commenced. The main entrance was guarded like the gate of a palace, reserved only for members who drove in luxury vehicles or bore titles that commanded respect. At the far end of the compound, a man dressed in worn-out sandals and a faded brown shirt with matching trousers stepped hesitantly through the back gate. He carried a small leather-bound Bible tucked under his arm and wore a quiet look of contentment. His face bore the marks of age and humility, but his eyes had a depth that spoke volumes. As he approached the church, no one greeted him and most people turned their heads away. To them, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place, a misfit amidst a sea of flamboyance. Matthew had been attending small churches all his life, but something drew him to Glory Tabernacle that morning. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was divine orchestration. The building was massive, with towering pillars, glittering glass windows, and an enormous LED screen at the entrance announcing the day's sermon, Unlocking the Secrets to Kingdom Wealth. He stood for a moment, watching the crowd pour into the sanctuary, men in suits that sparkled under the sunlight, women in high heels and dazzling headgear, children dressed like royalty. An usher noticed him and approached with a forced smile. "You can come in through the side entrance," she said, motioning toward a smaller, less decorated door. Matthew nodded silently and followed her. Inside he was ushered to the very last row, far from the altar, where the air conditioning barely reached and the screen was a blur of colors. The seats near the front were already occupied by prominent businesspeople, government officials, and a few local celebrities. No one noticed the man in the back pew. No one cared to ask his name or offer him a handshake. He was just another poor man seeking miracles. As the choir began their powerful ministration, the congregation rose to their feet, clapping and swaying in rhythm. Matthew stood as well, though he did not sing. His eyes were fixed on the altar, where a large golden throne-like chair was placed for the man of God. Moments later, Reverend Josiah Dyke entered the auditorium to thunderous applause. Clad in a white robe trimmed with gold, he walked slowly to the altar, pausing to wave at dignitaries and give his signature smile. He was the embodiment of success, a pastor who had built his reputation on messages of prosperity and divine abundance. His presence commanded attention. But as his eyes scanned the crowd, he did not notice Matthew sitting at the back. Or perhaps he did, but dismissed him as irrelevant. The service began with pomp and pageantry, but even amid the excitement, something in Matthew's spirit was unsettled. He wasn't there to be seen. He wasn't there for handouts or recognition. He had come for something deeper, a spiritual encounter. And though the pastor might not have seen him, heaven certainly had. Reverend Josiah Dyke stood tall at the pulpit like a king addressing his kingdom. His voice boomed through the massive speakers, reaching every corner of the sanctuary. "God doesn't want his children to be beggars," he declared. "Poverty is a curse, and this altar is the gateway to prosperity." The congregation erupted in cheers, waving handkerchiefs and lifting hands adorned with gold rings and diamond bracelets. The pastor's designer shoes glinted under the stage lights, and his expensive wristwatch sparkled every time he raised his hand to emphasize a point. Behind him, a massive screen displayed pictures of his recent missionary trip to Dubai, complete with captions like "Kingdom Expansion" and "Glory Tour 2025. Every aspect of his ministry was curated to reflect success. To him, wealth wasn't just a blessing, it was proof of holiness. He seldom spoke of sacrifice or humility, and when he did, it was usually to contrast them with the rewards of giving. The richer a person became, the more respected they were in Glory Tabernacle. And those who had little? They were seen as spiritually lazy, unworthy of the spotlight. Over the years, Reverend Josiah had built more than just a church, he had built an empire. His name was synonymous with affluence, and his teachings were laced with financial wisdom, business strategies, and motivational quotes that made him more of a life coach than a spiritual shepherd. Every Sunday he would recount tales of his meetings with governors, foreign investors, and other high-profile individuals. "I don't associate with mediocrity," he once said during a leadership summit hosted in the church. "My God is not broke, so why should I entertain poverty?" His words were often met with thunderous applause, especially from the elite members who felt validated by his message. Meanwhile, the less privileged congregants nodded silently, trying to reconcile their struggles with the gospel of success they were being fed. There was no room for the broken or the weary, unless they came bearing seed offerings. Josiah's pride had grown with each building the church erected, each car he added to his fleet, and each title he acquired. He no longer walked among the people. He ascended stages, flanked by bodyguards and adorned in robes that cost more than some members earned in a year. When the service ended that day, Josiah made his usual grand exit. The front pews lined up to greet him, men with briefcases, women with expensive perfumes, and youths who idolized him. Matthew remained seated, watching silently as the pastor walked past, only inches away without sparing him a glance. The man who had once knelt beside the broken and prayed for the sick now only touched those who came with envelopes. That evening in the pastor's office, he met with the board to discuss the upcoming City of Glory project, a multi-billion naira expansion plan that included a shopping complex, guest house, and television studio. "We must attract more influential people," Josiah said. "People of value." He didn't mention names, but everyone knew he wasn't referring to people like Matthew. To him, the church wasn't a refuge, it was a platform. A stage for displaying divine greatness through earthly wealth. And anyone who didn't fit that picture was simply a background prop in his glittering show. The following Sunday, the atmosphere at Glory Tabernacle was even more electrified than usual. A guest celebrity was expected, an actress known for her lavish lifestyle and controversial social media presence. The ushers were briefed ahead of time, instructed to prioritize seating for VIPs. Reverend Josiah had even rearranged the front rows to accommodate media coverage, ensuring the cameras captured only the most visually appealing angles. That morning, Matthew arrived earlier than most, hoping to sit closer to the altar for a more immersive worship experience. Quietly and humbly, he walked down the aisle and slipped into an empty front row seat. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes in prayer, unaware of the commotion that would soon follow. One of the assistant pastors noticed him and immediately whispered into his walkie-talkie. Moments later, 2 ushers hurried to his seat, tapping him gently on the shoulder. "Sir, you can't sit here," one of them said with forced politeness, trying to mask irritation with diplomacy. Matthew looked up, confused but unbothered. "Is this seat reserved?" he asked. "Yes," they replied, even though there was no name tag or indication. "This section is for partners and special guests." Before Matthew could protest, the head usher arrived, visibly embarrassed to see the poor man occupying such a prime location. "Please come with us," she said firmly. Without resistance, Matthew rose and followed them quietly. He was led to the back row again, where the seats were closer to the exit and often occupied by latecomers and first-timers. As he sat, he glanced at the pulpit, his face calm but his eyes revealing a trace of sorrow. Not because he was humiliated, but because he understood that this church had forgotten the very essence of Christianity: love without prejudice, grace without discrimination. The worship began louder and grander than before, but something sacred had been lost. Meanwhile, Reverend Josiah took the stage, basking in the attention of cameras and dignitaries. He offered a rehearsed smile and opened his sermon with a story about a wealthy business tycoon he had dined with the night before. "You are the company you keep," he said, eyeing the front row guests with admiration. As he continued, he subtly referenced people who forced themselves into spaces they haven't earned, calling them spiritual trespassers. The congregation laughed, oblivious to the cruelty embedded in his words. Matthew, seated at the back, listened without flinching. He understood what was happening and why. Still, he remained silent. After the service, no one greeted him. No one even acknowledged his presence. He slipped out quietly, like a shadow fading into the sunlight. But as he walked home, he muttered under his breath a scripture: "The last shall be first and the first last." He wasn't angry, only disappointed. For now. The next week, a private board meeting was held in the luxurious conference room adjacent to the church's administrative wing. The table was filled with key members of the church leadership, business executives, political figures, and the head of finance. Reverend Josiah sat at the head of the table like a CEO preparing to pitch an ambitious project. He wore a sleek, dark blue suit, and a gold pen rested elegantly between his fingers. "Gentlemen, and lady," he began, nodding to the only female board member, "we are on the verge of greatness." He unveiled the blueprint for the City of Glory project, a sprawling complex that would house a modern church auditorium, commercial outlets, event centers, and even a private Christian school. The room erupted in applause. The vision was impressive, no doubt. But, he continued, to secure funding and the necessary government approvals, we need to attract more high-value individuals. He paused dramatically, letting the weight of his words sink in. We need people of class. Influence. Not liabilities. One board member raised a hand. By liabilities do you mean? He trailed off, not wanting to be direct. Josiah smirked. I mean people who have nothing to offer. People who take and never give. People like... He stopped himself and chuckled. Never mind. Let's just say we need a more refined image. They all nodded in agreement. The pastor went on to propose a new initiative, a tiered membership system, where members would be grouped based on their financial commitments to the church. This way, he explained, we know who to prioritize. No one objected. The board approved the motion unanimously, and the meeting moved on to budget allocation and partnership strategies. Behind the polished language and sleek presentations was an ugly truth. Glory Tabernacle was no longer a sanctuary for all. It was a high-end spiritual club, and only those who could pay the dues were welcome. Matthew's name came up briefly when someone asked about his identity. Josiah shrugged. He's just a wanderer, he said dismissively. Probably looking for a free meal or transport fare. As the meeting ended, Josiah stood by the window of his office, sipping from a glass of imported wine. Outside, he saw Matthew walking past the church gates, his humble clothes clinging to his frame in the afternoon heat. The pastor scoffed. God helps those who help themselves, he muttered. He had no idea who Matthew truly was, nor did he care. To him, the poor man was just another invisible soul in the crowd, unworthy of the church's attention. But something deeper stirred in the atmosphere that day. A shift. Heaven had seen everything. The arrogance, the pride, the rejection of the lowly. And as Josiah returned to his desk, signing off documents for his next international conference, the winds of divine justice began to blow silently, preparing a storm that would soon shake the very foundation of everything he had built. Midweek brought an unexpected surprise to the church finance office. A donation of 50 million naira appeared in the church's bank account with no attached name or reference beyond a cryptic message. For the children. The treasurer, Mrs. Imelda Ojua, was stunned. She checked with the usual high-value donors, but none of them had made the contribution. Perhaps it's one of our international partners, she thought, but when she reached out to the major benefactors abroad, they all denied it. Confused but thrilled, she reported the donation to Reverend Josiah. His eyes widened at the figure, and a broad grin stretched across his face. Glory to God, he exclaimed. This is divine favor. Without asking further questions, he immediately ordered the funds be used to upgrade the children's church building. Air conditioners, educational tablets, colorful furniture, and more. A photo shoot was arranged, and Josiah called the media to cover the transformation. He stood before the cameras with arms stretched and declared, "This is what your seed does, beloved. This is the result of partnering with grace." What he didn't know was that the money came from Matthew, the man he had consistently humiliated. It wasn't the first time Matthew had given quietly. He had previously paid for repairs in the church toilets, repainted the usher's room, and even settled the tuition fees for a junior choir member, all anonymously. He never sought recognition. He believed that if his right hand gave, his left hand didn't need to know. He didn't give to be noticed but because he saw needs and felt compelled by compassion. When he walked past the children's church that Sunday and saw the changes, he smiled to himself, happy that the children would be comfortable. But when he saw Reverend Josiah giving a speech taking full credit, something shifted in him. Not out of pride or offense, but a quiet realization that sometimes humility is not just about silence, it's about discernment. He began to question if the seed he had sown was in fertile ground or merely falling on the stage of vanity. That Sunday during service, the congregation buzzed about the transformation. Josiah preached another sermon on kingdom wealth and divine favor. When you sow into fertile ground, he said, gesturing toward the new children's wing, God multiplies it. No mention was made of the unknown giver. Matthew, sitting at the back as usual, listened with a calm expression. He didn't expect a thank you. He didn't even need acknowledgement. But the message that day revealed the pastor's heart. Josiah's pride had grown so blinding that he could no longer distinguish between God's grace and his own ambition. He attributed everything good to his mantle, not realizing he was merely a custodian. Matthew watched as people cheered and applauded, not for the truth but for the illusion of glory. And though his heart remained kind, he began to consider that perhaps this church, this man, was not what he seemed. Something was coming. something that would expose everything. It was a Wednesday evening after Bible study when Matthew finally decided to request a one-on-one meeting with Reverend Josiah. He had no special agenda, no demands, no complaints, no intention of correcting or confronting the pastor. All he wanted was a few minutes of personal prayer and counsel. Despite his status, Matthew believed in spiritual leadership and the importance of seeking guidance from someone appointed to shepherd God's people. He approached the church secretary's office and filled out the necessary request form. The young secretary, seeing his worn clothes and quiet demeanor, raised her eyebrows skeptically. "The pastor's very busy," she said, her voice laced with polite dismissal. "You may have to wait a few weeks, maybe months." Matthew nodded. "I'll wait," he said calmly, signing the paper and walking away. He returned every week to check, only to be told, "He's not available." Others, wealthy and well-dressed, came and went from the pastor's office with ease. But for Matthew the door remained shut. He never complained. He simply waited, week after week, in silence. Nearly a month passed before he was granted a meeting, squeezed into a 15-minute slot on a Thursday afternoon. When the day came, Matthew arrived 15 minutes early and waited patiently at the reception area. Pastor Josiah was in his office, reviewing proposals for a new international crusade in South Africa. When his assistant reminded him of the meeting with the poor man from the back pew, Josiah scoffed. "5 minutes," he muttered. "I don't have time for counseling today." Matthew was finally called in. As he entered the lavish office, decorated with imported furniture, scented candles and gold-trimmed drapes, he bowed respectfully. "Good afternoon, sir," he greeted. Josiah glanced up from his documents, barely making eye contact. "Yes, what is it?" he asked, already reaching for his phone. "I only wanted a moment of prayer," Matthew said softly, "just some spiritual direction, nothing more." The pastor nodded, impatiently tapping his fingers on the desk. "You should join the prayer line on Sunday," he said. "That's when we do this kind of thing." The meeting barely lasted 3 minutes. Josiah mumbled a quick prayer, filled with vague declarations, then stood up to indicate the meeting was over. "God bless you," he said dismissively. Matthew stood, thanked him sincerely and left without offense. But as Josiah sat back down, he chuckled to himself. "Imagine the audacity," he muttered. "These poor people think I have time to waste." He turned to his assistant. "Next time, make sure people like that go through the junior pastors." Outside, Matthew stepped into the sun, grateful for the prayer, even if it was rushed. He wasn't bitter. He simply felt sorry for the man who had no idea what he had just done. Somewhere deep in his spirit, Matthew began to sense that the end of a season was near. Not just for himself, but for this church, for the pride that had taken root in the pulpit. For now he remained silent. But heaven was still watching, and heaven was keeping record. Far from the marble floors and golden chandeliers of Glory Tabernacle, the land registry office buzzed with mundane activity. Clerks typed busily, filing paperwork and answering calls. Matthew arrived quietly that morning, carrying a slim leather folder. He greeted the receptionist warmly and made his way to a senior official's desk, an old friend named Mr. Nwachukwu who had known Matthew for over 2 decades. "You still prefer no special treatment even after all these years?" The man laughed as he offered Matthew a seat. "Always," Matthew replied with a smile. He handed over the folder. Inside were land ownership documents, title deeds, and lease agreements. The official reviewed them carefully. Everything was in order. The land on which Glory Tabernacle stood, nearly 5 acres of prime property, was fully registered under Matthew's name. He had inherited it from his father, a quiet land baron whose fortune had been built quietly and kept even more discreetly. When Glory Tabernacle approached them for lease 10 years ago, Matthew allowed it for a token fee, out of goodwill and belief in the church's mission. As the years passed, Matthew never once increased the rent. In fact, he often waived it. He believed in investing in spiritual things. But the church had changed. What began as a humble assembly had become a commercial enterprise. Reverend Josiah had never met or spoken with the landowner directly. His lawyers and property managers had handled everything. And Matthew, choosing anonymity, never introduced himself as the owner. "It's time," he said to Mr. Nwachukwu. "Terminate the lease. Notify them through official channels. No extensions." The official blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" Matthew nodded firmly. "Yes. It's no longer holy ground. Let them find another place to build their empire." The paperwork was signed that day, and within 48 hours, Glory Tabernacle received a formal notice. The land lease will expire in 30 days and will not be renewed. The church had 1 month to vacate the premises. The letter bore a name they had never seen before, Matthew O.'s. When the letter arrived on Josiah's desk, confusion turned to anger. "Who the hell is Matthew E.'s?" he bellowed. "Where is this nonsense coming from?" He summoned the church's legal team, who frantically pulled the lease file from storage. Their findings stunned everyone. The land the church had expanded, renovated, and glamorized for years wasn't theirs. It had been on lease all along, and now the owner wanted it back. "Find this man!" Josiah shouted, furious. "This has to be a mistake." But it wasn't. For the first time in years, the proud pastor faced a truth he had no control over. His empire was built on borrowed ground. And the very man he mocked, the man he dismissed as irrelevant, held the deed to the church's kingdom. The irony wasn't lost on heaven. Just before the eviction notice reached the board, Reverend Josiah had organized a grand appreciation banquet for the church's top partners. Held at a 5-star hotel ballroom, the event was a showcase of wealth and prestige. The invitation list was exclusive: CEOs, politicians, media personalities, and the wealthiest members of the church. It was more than just a celebration. It was a calculated public relations move to secure more funding for the City of Glory project. The hall was adorned with crystal chandeliers, golden cutlery, and waiters in tuxedos serving 3-course meals. The theme for the night was Kingdom Excellence, and Josiah arrived in a custom-tailored suit with a convoy of luxury cars. The media was present. Photographers flashed cameras as he walked down the red carpet, his wife by his side, both smiling like royalty. As the guests were being seated, a young intern in the media team made a mistake. He had accidentally sent an invitation to Matthew, believing he was one of the long-standing sponsors based on his anonymous donation records. Matthew arrived at the event in a modest black suit, neatly pressed but clearly not designer. The ushers were confused, unsure of how to receive him. But the invitation bore the church's seal, and his name matched the guest list. Reluctantly they allowed him in. He took a seat at one of the mid-tier tables, quietly sipping water as others ordered champagne. Some guests whispered, wondering who he was. Josiah hadn't noticed him, yet. But when he finally did, during his walk around the room, his face twisted in visible displeasure. He paused beside Matthew's table. "I think there's been a mistake," he said loudly, drawing attention. "This banquet is for key partners, those who have invested in the ministry." Matthew looked up and replied with gentle eyes, "I received an invitation, sir." "Well, you shouldn't have," Josiah snapped. "Ushers, please assist this man out." Embarrassed murmurs filled the room as Matthew stood calmly, nodded politely, and walked out without a word. The guests were uneasy. A few whispered that the pastor had overreacted. Others laughed uncomfortably. But Josiah ignored them and continued with his speech, boasting about the church's next global impact. Meanwhile, Matthew returned home, not hurt but solemn. That night, he wrote in his journal, "They only see the outside. But soon they will understand." The banquet continued with music, speeches, and pledges. But the spiritual atmosphere had shifted. What was meant to be a night of glory became a night of judgment in the heavens. A man of God had humiliated a brother in Christ, not knowing he had just embarrassed the very one who held the power to uproot everything. And heaven once again took note. Not of the food, not of the speeches, not of the $1,000,000 pledges, but of a man in a simple black suit, who walked out with grace while the proud remained blind. The Sunday following the banquet was expected to be just like every other, a grand celebration of wealth, worship, and prestige. But the atmosphere at Glory Tabernacle was tense. Rumors had started circulating about a mysterious eviction letter, and murmurs of confusion filled the hallways. The service began as usual with electrifying praise, vibrant instruments, and colorful LED screens flashing scriptures and offering prompts. Reverend Josiah walked into the sanctuary with his usual grandeur, ignoring the subtle unease he felt. His robe shimmered under the light, and his smile was as sharp as ever, but something about the air felt heavy. As he mounted the pulpit, he began with humor, telling the congregation about the strange drama at the banquet. "Can you believe," he said with a chuckle, "that a man walked in off the street thinking he could eat where kings dine?" The congregation laughed on cue. "Some people don't know their place," he added, scanning the crowd. As the laughter echoed, Josiah continued describing the event, but his tone shifted from humorous to condescending. "There are people in this church," he said pointedly, "who have never contributed a dime to this ministry, but they believe they're entitled to the same treatment as those who build this house." The camera zoomed in on his face. He was unaware that Matthew was once again seated at the back pew, his hands folded across his lap, his eyes fixed on the man who had mocked him publicly. Church is not a charity center, Josiah continued. God elevates givers, not beggars who think spiritual freebies are their inheritance. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Some members exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the direction of the message. But Josiah, basking in his pride, pressed on. This is why we're introducing partner classifications, he announced. So we know who truly belongs. Applause followed, but it was muted this time. No one clapped with the same energy. Something sacred was being trampled, and even the walls seemed to whisper a warning. At the back, Matthew slowly stood. Heads turned as he walked quietly toward the exit, not causing a scene, not saying a word. But his movement caught Josiah's eye. Their gazes met briefly. A flicker of recognition passed across Josiah's face, but he said nothing. Once Matthew was gone, Josiah continued the service, finishing the sermon and leading a powerful altar call filled with loud music and declarations. But the moment had passed. After service, the whispers grew louder. Who was that man? Why did the pastor humiliate him like that? Some of the older members began recalling the early days of the church, when the altar welcomed the broken, the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. A deacon, troubled in spirit, said aloud, "We have left the gospel of Christ. We've built a shrine of ego." By the next morning, the church's social media was buzzing, not with clips from the sermon, but with the lingering image of a silent man walking out of a palace built on pride. On Tuesday morning, the church secretary rushed into Reverend Josiah's office, waving a cream-colored envelope. "Sir, this came by courier," she said out of breath. Josiah took the envelope, curious but unconcerned. He tore it open slowly and began reading. His eyes scanned the paper, and at first he didn't react. Then he blinked, read it again, and finally stood up so abruptly his chair rolled backward. "What nonsense is this?" he shouted. The secretary jumped. "Sir?" Josiah read the letter aloud. "This is a formal reminder that the land lease on Plot 33B, currently occupied by Glory Tabernacle, is due to expire in 28 days and will not be renewed." The letter was signed by Matthew O.E.'s. Josiah's mind raced. The name. The man at the banquet. The quiet one in the back pew. It couldn't be. He called the legal team and demanded an emergency meeting. Within hours, they confirmed everything. The man Josiah had mocked, dismissed, and belittled for months was the rightful owner of the land the entire church was built on. The revelation hit Josiah like a thunderbolt. He couldn't breathe. "This can't be," he whispered, pacing the room. "There has to be a loophole. Some way to stop this." But the lawyers shook their heads. "Everything is legal. You've been on a 10-year lease. It was never purchased." Josiah sat down slowly, rubbing his temples. "He's been here the whole time. I never knew." The memory of Matthew's face haunted him now. Every insult, every dismissal, every cold glance, it all replayed in his mind like a horror film. He had embarrassed a man of such stature not once, but several times, and in the worst ways. But it wasn't just about status. Josiah realized he had spat in the face of humility, trampled on grace, and built his church on sand. He called for an emergency board meeting. That evening, the room was full of anxious voices. "We must appeal to him. Let's offer to buy the land." But nothing worked. Matthew had already responded through his lawyer. No negotiations. The church must vacate. News spread like wildfire. By Wednesday, congregants were discussing it openly. "You mean that quiet man? He owns the land?" Pastor mocked him. "This is God's judgment." The church's social media team tried to do damage control, but the screenshots of the eviction letter had already leaked. Members began questioning the leadership. Donations slowed. Some major partners quietly withdrew their pledges. And Josiah, once the untouchable oracle of wealth, now found himself at the mercy of a man he had treated worse than dirt. He stood in his office that night, staring out the window at the glowing sign of Glory Tabernacle. But the glory had started to fade. The heavens had moved, and there was no stopping what was coming. The building was still standing, but the foundation, spiritual, emotional, and legal, was already crumbling. The following Sunday, the pews weren't as full. A noticeable emptiness hung over the congregation. The usual electric atmosphere was muted, and though the choir sang with passion, the echoes of their voices didn't carry the same fire. Josiah took the pulpit as always, but this time there was no applause. No cheers. Only silence. His robe, crisp and regal, did little to mask the weariness in his eyes. He cleared his throat. "I know many of you have heard some things," he began, his voice low. And I want to clarify them. Murmurs flickered through the crowd. It is true that our land lease is ending. And yes, it is true that the owner has chosen not to renew it. He paused, visibly swallowing his pride. I was unaware of his identity. And I may have handled things poorly. He didn't say Matthew's name. He didn't confess fully. But it was enough to shake the remaining illusion of perfection he had long maintained. Some members nodded in dismay. Others bowed their heads in prayer. A few stood up and walked out. Later that afternoon, a respected elder in the church posted a video on social media. He had been present when the church was just a small fellowship under a tree, and he shared a heartfelt message. We have lost our way, he said. We've replaced Christ with class, humility with hierarchy, faith with flamboyance. The video went viral. By Monday, journalists were requesting interviews with Matthew. He refused them all. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want revenge. All he wanted was to restore dignity to a sacred space that had become a platform for pride. Meanwhile, Josiah tried reaching out personally. He sent letters, emissaries, even offered to donate the entire children's building to Matthew's charity if he reconsidered. But every response was the same: it is done. Even his most loyal followers began asking hard questions. Why didn't you know? How could you treat someone so badly? The man who once stood on a pedestal of admiration was now drowning in a sea of accountability. At a press conference organized in desperation, Josiah finally said Matthew's name. Mr. Matthew Ease. I didn't know who you were, and for that I am sorry. But it was too late. The world had seen the truth. And more importantly, so had heaven. A man once exalted by men had been humbled by God. And the man once hidden in the back pew had been revealed, not just as the landowner, but as a quiet instrument of divine justice. By the end of that week, posters began appearing around the church walls. Final service, next Sunday. A ministry built on image had collapsed under the weight of truth. And for the first time in his life, Josiah stood before a mirror and saw himself, not as a man of God but as a man undone by pride. The office was quieter than usual that Thursday afternoon. The once busy reception had slowed down drastically since the announcement that the church would soon close its doors. Reverend Josiah sat alone in his office, staring at the framed portraits that once adorned his wall with pride. Photos of international crusades, meetings with governors, and groundbreaking ceremonies. They felt like relics from a past life. For days he had wrestled with his pride, struggling to gather the courage to do what he had never done sincerely: apologize. But now, with everything slipping through his fingers, he knew he had no other choice. He sent one last request through his legal counsel, asking for a private meeting with Matthew. He didn't expect it to be granted. But the reply came simply: tomorrow, 11 a.m. Come alone. Josiah barely slept that night. His dreams were filled with flashbacks of every moment he had ridiculed the man. Each insult now echoed with a different tone, one of deep shame. At exactly 11 a.m., Josiah arrived at a modest estate tucked into a quiet neighborhood. There were no guards at the gate, just a small security booth and well-trimmed lawns. He was guided into a warm, sunlit sitting room with no extravagant furniture, only tasteful simplicity. Matthew entered moments later, dressed in a plain white shirt and gray trousers. He greeted Josiah with a slight nod, not with bitterness but with quiet dignity. Josiah stood, his voice catching in his throat. Sir, Mr. Ease, I came to apologize, he began. I treated you with dishonor. I looked at your clothes and I made assumptions. I spoke down on you, humiliated you, and I didn't know. Matthew remained standing, his eyes soft but unreadable. Josiah continued, his voice trembling. I am truly sorry. Not because of what I've lost but because of what I failed to be: a shepherd, a brother, a man of God. Silence followed. For a long time Matthew didn't speak. Then he sighed deeply and sat down. It was never about me, Reverend. It was about your heart. The two men sat across from each other for nearly an hour. Matthew didn't speak much, but what he did say pierced deeper than any sermon Josiah had ever preached. You built a stage, not an altar, he said quietly. You drew crowds, not souls. And when God tested you with a stranger in plain clothes, you failed. Josiah bowed his head, tears silently rolling down his face. He had expected a scolding. What he received instead was a mirror, reflecting everything he had become. At the end of the meeting, Matthew shook his hand gently. I forgive you, he said. But the land decision remains. Not out of anger, but because it's time for something new to grow where ego once stood. Josiah left the estate in silence. No entourage. No convoy. Just a broken man in a simple car, driving back toward a crumbling empire. And for the first time in his life, he understood what Jesus meant by losing the world and forfeiting one's soul. The impact of the eviction and the exposure of Josiah's pride rippled far beyond the church walls. Donors withdrew their support, international partners severed ties, and longtime members left quietly, some in tears, others in anger. The once majestic Glory Tabernacle had begun to decay, first spiritually and now visibly. The cleaning staff was reduced. The lights that once beamed onto Josiah's golden altar dimmed. And the grand City of Glory project was officially canceled. Church programs were scaled down to basic services. The choir, once boasting over 50 well-paid vocalists and instrumentalists, now operated with volunteers. The administrative offices that used to buzz with activity were mostly empty, and departments merged to save costs. But more than the structure, it was the spirit that had shifted. Worship no longer felt like celebration, it felt like mourning. And though Josiah still stood at the pulpit, his voice had lost its thunder. The man who once preached about dominion now struggled to teach about humility. The board of directors, many of whom were deeply implicated in the church's corporate focus, began resigning one by one. Public statements were issued, distancing themselves from the unfortunate events. Some claimed ignorance of Josiah's behavior, while others took the opportunity to quietly move to other ministries. Even Josiah's closest allies began to disappear, sensing that the ship was sinking fast. His wife, Patricia, who once sat like a queen at the front row, barely attended service anymore. Their children, who used to be paraded on stage as models of Christian success, had stopped appearing in public. Scandal rumors brewed on social media, and though none had been confirmed, the silence from leadership only fueled speculation. The final blow came when the church's bank froze its expansion account due to internal investigations on financial mismanagement. Josiah's private assets tied to the ministry were also under review. In just a few weeks, the man who had towered over the city's spiritual landscape had become a cautionary tale. Internally, Josiah was unraveling. He could no longer sleep without sedatives. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the sanctuary collapsing in slow motion. He stopped giving interviews, stopped meeting with the press, and eventually stopped attending board meetings altogether. In his solitude, he began reading scriptures he hadn't touched in years, ones about brokenness, repentance, and true servanthood. He realized he had read the Bible for applause, not for transformation. His sermons were performance scripts, not divine revelations. And though his name still echoed in some circles, it was no longer with honor, but with regret. He had been a celebrity pastor. But now, stripped of the lights, the wealth, and the validation, he stood as just a man, broken, humbled, and uncertain of what redemption would look like. But the fall wasn't over yet. What had begun in silence would end in silence. For God was not yet done breaking the idol that had been built in his name. It began with a leaked document, an internal audit commissioned by a former board member who had grown uncomfortable with the financial secrecy of the ministry. The document showed years of mismanaged funds, questionable real estate purchases, and unexplained withdrawals under Josiah's signature. Though not all of it pointed to corruption, it painted a clear picture. Glory Tabernacle had been run more like a corporation than a church. The media pounced on the story. Headlines splashed across screens and newspapers: pastor under fire for misuse of church funds, ex-members speak out about spiritual abuse, from pulpit to prophet, the rise and fall of Glory Tabernacle. Within days the entire city was talking. Former members came forward, some tearfully recounting how they were coerced to give offerings they couldn't afford, shamed for their poverty, or manipulated into service with no support. Others spoke about being ignored when they were sick or bereaved, unless they were financial pillars. The truth was now in the open, and it was uglier than anyone had imagined. The National Christian Leadership Council launched an investigation. Though Josiah wasn't arrested, he was summoned to appear before a panel to explain the financial operations of his church. On live television, he sat across from stern-looking clerics and auditors, stammering as he tried to defend years of extravagance. "I believed I was building God's kingdom," he said feebly. But the numbers told a different story. The multi-million naira mansion he called a ministry residence, the convoy of imported vehicles labeled evangelism tools, and the frequent first-class trips to Europe, all paid for by the tithes of faithful members. Videos of the hearing went viral. Memes followed. Once admired, Josiah had now become a national spectacle. His sermons, which once inspired multitudes, were now dissected and criticized for theological emptiness and manipulative undertones. The entire nation watched a man unravel, not by scandal alone, but by the weight of his own unchecked ego. Inside what was left of Glory Tabernacle, chairs sat empty. The once overflowing services were now attended by a few loyalists and curious onlookers. Some came to see the fall for themselves. Others came hoping for closure. Josiah, though still showing up on Sundays, had lost his fire. His messages were short, sometimes incoherent, and often interrupted by his own emotional breakdowns. He wept in the pulpit more than he preached. The man who had once controlled a spiritual empire could now barely read a verse without his voice cracking. His world had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. And through it all, Matthew remained silent. He didn't mock, didn't gloat, didn't celebrate the fall. Instead he prayed, from afar. Not for Josiah to be restored to fame, but for his soul to be saved. For redemption to take root where pride had been uprooted. And heaven, watching still, began to stir something deeper in the soil of brokenness. It was a sight no one ever imagined. The once glorious auditorium of Glory Tabernacle, which had been filled with thousands every Sunday, now echoed with the sound of hollow silence. Rows upon rows of plush red seats stood untouched, their vibrant fabric gathering dust. The LED screens, once pulsing with dynamic Bible verses and visuals, now flickered with static due to unpaid maintenance fees. The chandelier lights that once sparkled now hung dim and cold. The grand altar, where Josiah once stood like a king, looked abandoned, the golden podium slightly tilted after months of neglect. Only a handful of members still attended, most of them either too loyal to leave or too broken to find another church home. They sat spread across the room, scattered like fallen leaves in a storm. Some came out of curiosity, others from pity. But the spirit that once moved in that sanctuary had long departed, replaced by an eerie stillness that no song could stir. Josiah still showed up on Sundays wearing the same white robe, though its shine had faded. He looked thinner now, his cheeks sunken, eyes heavy with sleeplessness and regret. He no longer walked in with bodyguards or assistants. He opened his own doors, arranged his own mic, and sometimes even swept the pulpit before preaching. There was no choir to back him up, no media crew to flash his face on the screen. Just him, and the echo of his own voice. His sermons, once filled with declarations of wealth and divine connections, were now raw and painful reflections. He spoke more about brokenness than breakthrough, more about confession than conquest. "I built a kingdom," he said one Sunday, "but not for God, for myself. And now that kingdom is in ruins." The few who listened often wept. Not just because of what had been lost, but because they saw a man finally stripped of pride, standing bare before God and man. Still, not everyone pitied him. Some former members held on to bitterness. "He mocked us when we were poor," one woman told a local blogger. "Now he wants sympathy?" Others demanded restitution. Lawsuits began trickling in, from contractors, former employees, even vendors who had supplied materials for the failed City of Glory project. Josiah tried selling some of his private properties to settle debts, but the market had heard the rumors. His assets were now liabilities. His wife, Patricia, had taken their children and moved out weeks earlier. She couldn't bear to watch his collapse any longer, nor forgive him for dragging their family into shame. "I married a shepherd," she said, "but he became a pharaoh." Josiah was truly alone now. The applause was gone. The spotlight had dimmed. And all that remained was a hollow temple and a man who had once been celebrated for his power, now forgotten in the very house he claimed to have built. Josiah's new home was a rented two-bedroom apartment in the outskirts of the city, far from the gated estate where he once lived. The neighborhood was rough, filled with potholes, rusted gates, and the daily clamor of survival. His car, once a brand-new Range Rover, had been seized by the bank. He now took public transport, squeezed between strangers who didn't recognize him or worse, recognized him and whispered. The man who once walked with mayors now waited at crowded bus stops under the sun, holding a worn-out Bible and plastic bag of groceries. At first it felt like punishment, but gradually it became a mirror. For the first time in decades he began to see people, not as assets, donors, or distractions, but as human beings with stories, wounds, and silent prayers. He heard children cry in the night, saw mothers work 2 jobs, watched fathers break down in frustration. And he began to understand what it meant to suffer without a stage or microphone to shout about it. He tried applying for speaking engagements at smaller churches, but no one wanted to invite the disgraced, celebrity pastor. Some mocked him. Others prayed for him, but from a distance. He offered to clean a nearby church in exchange for joining their prayer meetings. They allowed him, not knowing who he was, just a tired man with hollow eyes who mopped floors and arranged chairs before dawn. Josiah found strange peace in the anonymity. No one called him Daddy Geo here. No one rushed to carry his Bible or fight to sit at his feet. He was just Josiah, a man among men. He spent his evenings reading the Psalms, his mornings weeping in the sanctuary before anyone arrived. And slowly something in his heart began to shift, not just regret but repentance. Not just sorrow for being caught but sorrow for being lost in plain sight for so long. He had preached about God all his life, but now he was finally learning how to walk with him. Then came the worst night of all. It rained heavily and Josiah couldn't sleep. The roof of his apartment leaked, soaking his mattress. As he stepped outside for air, barefoot and shivering, he saw himself reflected in a puddle. His robe clinging to his frame, hair wet, face pale. The same man who once had his sermons translated in 5 languages was now a forgotten voice in the wind. He slumped beside the road and wept, not just from cold but from a soul fractured. God, he whispered, if you still want me, I'm here. Not as a preacher. Not as a prophet. Just as your son. I have nothing left but breath. And I give even that to you. That night heaven heard. And though the rain continued to fall, Josiah felt something shift. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was the first real prayer he had said in years, and the first one God truly received. 2 weeks later, Glory Tabernacle was officially closed. A for-lease sign now stood in front of the once mighty sanctuary. The front doors were locked. The car park was empty. The pulpit silent. Josiah stood outside the gates that morning, staring through the rusting iron bars at the building he once called his kingdom. He had nowhere to go. His rent had expired and he couldn't raise the money. His phone had been disconnected, and even the last friend who had housed him for a few nights had grown tired of his presence. With nowhere else to turn, he returned to the only place that had once given him meaning, even if it no longer welcomed him. He curled up under the canopy by the gate, shielding himself from the harsh sun with a torn shawl. Passers-by looked at him in confusion. Few recognized him. Those who did crossed the road. Is that really? One man whispered. Yes. That's Pastor Josiah. That night, as darkness fell, Josiah sat by the gate with an empty plastic cup and a tin of sardines someone had tossed his way. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just stared at the church he once ruled from, now nothing more than concrete in memory. He remembered the sermons, the altar calls, the conferences. He remembered the applause, the titles, the pride. And he remembered Matthew, quiet, steady, unwavering in the face of insult. A man who had walked away with grace while Josiah clung to empty glory. He felt a nudge in his heart, like the echo of an old voice. He who exalts himself shall be humbled. And he who humbles himself shall be exalted. He wept again, not for the last time. Not from pity but from clarity. He had become everything he once warned others about. A man lost in the pursuit of power, now sitting at the gate of the very house he built with ego. In the early hours of the morning, a figure approached the gate silently. It was Matthew. Dressed simply as always, he carried a small bag in one hand and a flask in the other. He saw Josiah curled up by the wall and paused. For a moment he said nothing. Then he stepped forward and knelt beside him. Gently he placed the bag beside Josiah and opened the flask. Hot tea, he said quietly. Josiah stirred, blinking in disbelief. You came? He stammered. Matthew nodded. I've always been here. You just never saw me. Josiah tried to speak, but no words came. Only tears. Matthew didn't preach. He didn't scold. He simply sat there, sharing silence like a brother. The proud had been brought low. The meek had remained steadfast. And now, the one mocked in the pew had become a messenger at the gate, not of revenge but of mercy. For though the church had closed, the heart of God had just reopened. 3 days after their silent meeting by the church gate, Josiah awoke to the sound of footsteps approaching. He opened his eyes slowly and saw a small envelope placed beside the empty tea flask Matthew had left behind. There was no name on it, only a simple inscription in careful handwriting, "To the broken man who still matters." Josiah sat up slowly, his joints aching from nights on the hard pavement. He held the envelope in his trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. Was it a warning? A rebuke? A reminder of his shame? He tore it open with hesitation and unfolded the letter inside. What he read made him break into fresh tears, not of sorrow but of something unfamiliar and holy. It was mercy, woven into every line, pouring into the hollow spaces of his heart like rain into a cracked desert. Matthew had written not with bitterness but with kindness. I saw what you could not see, it began, and I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because I was once forgiven too. The letter didn't recount every insult or every humiliation. Instead, it gently highlighted the difference between falling and remaining fallen. You may have lost your pulpit, your people, your property, Matthew wrote, but you haven't lost the heart God once gave you. It's still there, buried beneath applause and pride. But I see it. And God sees it too. He reminded Josiah that true ministry wasn't about empires or stadiums, but about presence. Being present with the hurting, the overlooked, the forgotten. I know what it's like to be invisible in church, Matthew wrote. But I also know what it means to be seen by God. That's why I never left, not physically and not spiritually. I stayed, waiting for this moment. The last paragraph was a gentle invitation. Rise again, Josiah. Not to take the stage but to take your place, at the feet of Jesus, among the least of these. That's where greatness begins. Josiah folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, and wept like a child. Not because he was ashamed but because for the first time he felt truly seen, not as a pastor but as a soul in need of grace. That evening Josiah took a walk through the streets near the slum where he now lived. He saw things he had once ignored: children without shoes, mothers begging for medicine, young men preaching with cracked Bibles on street corners. These were the people he had once overlooked, calling them liabilities and burdens. But now, every face held a sermon. Every need became a prayer. He bought bread for a widow he often passed. He carried water for a disabled man. And when a group of children asked him to pray with them, he knelt in the dirt and whispered blessings over their heads, not as Reverend Josiah but as Brother Josiah. That night, he returned to the church gate and left a note of his own for Matthew. Thank you for not leaving me behind. I'm ready to learn now. I'm ready to serve. Whatever is left of me belongs to God. Word quietly began to spread through the community. Josiah, the fallen pastor, was changing. Not on TV, not in stadiums, but in the alleys and gutters of real life. He volunteered at soup kitchens, helped rebuild broken walls in an orphanage, and started mentoring young men from troubled backgrounds. He had no title, no income, and no following. But for the first time in his life, his presence carried peace. People began calling him Uncle Joe, a far cry from the intimidating Daddy Gio they once feared. He wore simple clothes now, always carried a worn-out Bible, and never asked for anything. He gave what little he had: his time, his ears, his prayers. And slowly the city began to forgive. Some former members who had left Glory Tabernacle began visiting him. We've never seen you like this, they said. This is the version of you we prayed for. Josiah never took credit. God broke me, he would whisper. And I thank him for it. One day, Matthew invited Josiah to a small house fellowship in a local community hall. It was nothing like the megachurch Josiah once led, just 20 people seated on plastic chairs, singing hymns off-key, sharing testimonies and tears. When Josiah was introduced, he stood slowly, unsure of what to say. I used to lead thousands, he began. But I failed them. Not because I sinned, but because I stopped seeing them. He shared his journey, not with flair but with deep honesty. By the end of his testimony, every eye in the room was wet. They saw not a disgraced man but a restored soul. From that day Josiah began teaching weekly Bible classes, not in stadiums but in slums and shelters. His words had lost their glitter but they gained weight. People listened not because he was famous but because he was real. And that was all they had ever wanted, a real shepherd. Months passed. The land where Glory Tabernacle once stood was transformed by Matthew into a community center named House of Mercy. It featured a free clinic, a vocational training wing, a prayer hall, and an outreach kitchen. Josiah volunteered there full-time, quietly sweeping, praying, and mentoring the broken. The irony was not lost on him. He now served in the very place he once ruled. But he did it with joy. One day as he finished sweeping the front walkway, a boy asked him, "Sir, were you the owner of this place?" Josiah smiled gently. "No, I wasn't the owner. I was just someone who thought he was." Then he added with a soft laugh, "But now, I'm just glad to belong here." That night, he knelt in the center's prayer room and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for letting me fall. Because in my fall, I found you again." It was a quiet Sunday morning. Sunlight spilled through the windows of the House of Mercy prayer hall, warming the plastic chairs and concrete floors. Matthew arrived early as he always did, wearing the same humble smile that had once been overlooked. He greeted everyone, helped carry hymn books, and sat at the very back, as he had always preferred. The front row was empty, but he didn't need a title or spotlight. He had done what God had asked him to do: expose, correct, forgive, and rebuild. As the worship began, voices rose gently in unpolished harmony, and Matthew closed his eyes. He didn't need fame or thanks. He had already seen the greatest miracle, the transformation of a man who had once humiliated him, now walking in humility and purpose. And that was enough. Across the hall, Josiah entered quietly and took a seat near the side wall. He wasn't scheduled to preach today. He had come to worship. Just worship.
As the service went on, the leader asked if anyone had a short word to share. A few hands went up. Josiah raised his too, but the leader hesitated, then nodded. Josiah rose slowly, walked to the front, and turned to face the congregation. "I don't have a sermon," he began. "Just a confession and a thank you." He looked directly at Matthew. "You taught me something no seminary ever could, that the back pew matters. That sometimes the man in the shadows is the one carrying the most light." He turned to the crowd. "If you're broken, overlooked, counted out, don't run. God sees you. And he might just use you to bring down pride and raise the kingdom again." The hall was silent. Then a soft amen echoed. And then another. And then many. Josiah smiled, stepped down, and walked straight to the back pew, where Matthew sat. He offered him his seat. But Matthew shook his head. "No," he said. "This time, I want you to sit with me." Josiah sat. The two men shared a moment of quiet brotherhood. No titles, no ranks, just grace. Around them, worship continued. Outside, children laughed. Inside, hearts healed. The man once consumed by pride had been humbled, and the man once dismissed had been honored, not by men, but by heaven. And though the walls bore no grand name, the Spirit of God moved freely. Because in this simple house of mercy, the message of the cross lived again. In brokenness, in forgiveness, in quiet strength. The man in the back pew had never truly left. He had simply waited. And now, sitting beside him, was a man finally redeemed. 2 lives changed. 1 kingdom restored. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tales by Tochi for more.